He was told he could never be a father until his ex showed up with twin girls who had his eyes. What follows is a breathtaking story of regret, redemption, and the kind of love that only comes when you fight for it. From heartbreak to healing, this story proves it's never too late to come home. Where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more unforgettable stories like this one. I used to think I had it all. From the outside, people saw me as Grant Langford, tech mogul, Forbes cover man, the guy who turned a scrappy startup into a billion-dollar empire before his 40th birthday. I lived in a glass tower overlooking San Francisco Bay, drove a car that purred like a panther, and wore suits tailored so sharp they could slice paper. Every hour of my day was scheduled, every inch of my life curated. I had control over everything, except the one thing that mattered more than I dared admit. 3 years ago, a doctor sat across from me with the same calm voice people use to deliver bad stock news. I can still hear him. "Mr. Langford, I'm sorry. You're infertile. It's congenital and irreversible." He even handed me a pamphlet about adoption and surrogacy like it was a consolation prize. I nodded, thanked him politely, and left the office as if I'd just walked out of a lunch meeting. But something cracked wide open inside me that day. A private, quiet earthquake no one else could see. I never told anyone. Not my board, not my friends, not even Rachel. Especially not Rachel. She was everything I wasn't. Spontaneous, warm, the kind of woman who cried at adoption commercials and laughed so freely it made strangers turn their heads. She made me feel human, which, for a man like me, was both terrifying and addictive. I loved her. But after the diagnosis, I began pulling away, retreating into the only sanctuary I understood: work. I told myself I was protecting her from a future without children. In truth, I was protecting myself from the shame of feeling broken. One night we had a fight, our last. She asked me if I even wanted to build a life together. I said something cruel, something meant to push her away. I told her I didn't believe in fairy tales. She left crying. I didn't chase her. A week later, I changed my number. A month after that, I moved to Tokyo for a 2-year expansion campaign. By the time I got back, Rachel was a memory I filed away next to other regrets I pretended not to have. I kept my life polished and predictable after that. My calendar filled with shareholder meetings and speaking events, dinners with investors, photo ops for tech journals. I bought a new place. Sleek, modern, minimalist. I even had a fridge stocked by a company that delivered emotionally intelligent meal plans. My assistant, Linda, once joked that even my espresso machine had abandonment issues. I laughed. It was easier than explaining the silence in my penthouse when the elevator doors closed behind me each night. But every so often, usually around 3 a.m. when sleep wouldn't come, I'd find myself staring at the ceiling, wondering what it would have felt like to hear the sound of little feet padding down the hallway. I never allowed those thoughts to linger. I had made peace with it. Or so I thought. That illusion shattered on a gray Wednesday afternoon in late November. I was in the middle of a high-stakes meeting with the board, something about a merger with a cybersecurity firm, when Linda leaned down and whispered in my ear. "Mr. Langford, there's a woman downstairs. She says it's urgent." I barely glanced up. "Tell security to handle it." Linda hesitated. "She has 2 little girls with her. She says her name is Rachel Moore." The name hit me like a sucker punch to the ribs. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't move. Rachel. Here. Now. My mind scrambled to find logic, to assign meaning to something that had none. I stood abruptly, excusing myself without explanation, and took the elevator down 38 floors in silence that felt like free fall. I saw her the moment the doors opened. She stood in the lobby, her coat unzipped, her blonde hair longer than I remembered, softer around her face. But her eyes, that spark I used to love, looked tired. Not broken, but worn. And beside her, clinging to each hand, were 2 little girls in matching coats. They couldn't have been more than 2.5, maybe 3. They looked up at me with wide blue eyes. My eyes. My knees nearly buckled. Rachel didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just looked at me, like she'd been rehearsing this moment for years and didn't have the luxury of letting emotion ruin it. "We need to talk," she said quietly, adjusting one of the girls on her hip. "These are your daughters." The world tilted. The ceiling of my fortress cracked. I stared, stunned, while her words echoed like a fire alarm I couldn't turn off. Daughters. Mine. No, impossible. I remembered the doctor. I remembered the chart. I remembered how final it all was. But then Clara, the one on the left I'd learn later, tilted her head at me and smiled, and for a fleeting moment I saw myself as a child, looking back through time. My throat closed, my chest tightened. I was a man who prided himself on never flinching. But in that moment, I was utterly, irreversibly unraveled. I didn't know it then, but the life I had spent years building, the empire, the routine, the silence, was about to be dismantled by two tiny strangers and the woman I had never stopped loving. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of losing control. I was afraid of not being worthy of what stood in front of me. I followed her into a small side room off the lobby, the kind reserved for quiet conversations or overflow meetings. I had walked through that room 100 times. Today, it felt foreign, too small to hold the weight of the moment. The two little girls, mine, she had said, clung to her legs as she settled them onto the worn leather couch. I didn't sit. I couldn't. My legs were too stiff, too uncertain. My mind was still reeling, trying to reconcile what my eyes were telling me with what my brain refused to believe. I know what you're thinking, Rachel said quietly, and I don't blame you. I wanted to say something sharp, something that would shield me from the tidal wave crashing toward me, but all I could manage was a hoarse, "How?" She reached into her bag, her hands calm but deliberate. She handed me an envelope, manila, thick, the kind that carried news that changed people's lives. I took it reluctantly, my fingers brushing hers for the first time in years. There was no spark, just warmth. Familiar, unwelcome, dangerous. Inside was a certified DNA test. My name, Grant Langford. The children's names, Clara Moore, June Moore. Probability of biological paternity, 99.9%. I stared at it like a man holding a grenade with the pin already pulled. I had the test done twice, she said softly, anticipating my next objection. Same results. I didn't come here to play games, Grant. My hand trembled slightly as I lowered the paper. But I was told it was impossible. I was diagnosed. I sat across from a doctor who looked me in the eye and told me I'd never. I stopped myself, voice cracking on the edge of something I didn't want to show. Rachel didn't interrupt. She just waited, her eyes patient, steady, and heartbreakingly sad. I'd forgotten how steady she could be in chaos. I know, she finally said. I remember you told me you had a checkup that month. And then you disappeared. You cut off everything. No explanation. I swallowed hard. Shame burned through my gut. I thought it was protecting you, that it would be easier. Easier? Her voice was still soft, but there was a steel in it now. I was pregnant, Grant. I didn't even know yet when you left. I found out 2 weeks after you vanished. I tried to reach you. You changed numbers. Your company wouldn't forward my calls. I had no address, no way to reach you directly. I thought, maybe you just didn't want to know. I turned away, unable to meet her eyes. The worst part wasn't what she said. It was the knowledge that, at the time, she might have been right. I moved back east for a while, she continued, voice quieter now. Had them in Connecticut. Moved back to the Bay last year to be near my sister. I told myself I could do it alone. And I did, but a few weeks ago, June got sick. Nothing serious, but enough to scare me. And I looked at them, and I realized they deserved to know you. Not for money, for you, for who you are, or at least who I thought you were. I finally sat down across from her, the weight of her words pinning me in place. I looked at the two girls. Clara was sitting up straight, legs dangling off the couch, eyes darting between me and her mother. June was nestled closer to Rachel, thumb in her mouth, watching me cautiously like a skittish fawn. They were beautiful, golden hair, soft cheeks, and those eyes, blue-gray, the exact shade I saw every morning in the mirror. How could this happen? I murmured. How could the doctor be wrong? Rachel shrugged lightly. I'm not a scientist. All I know is biology didn't follow the plan, and now here we are. Here we are, I echoed numbly, still processing. You should have told me. I tried, she said again, not angrily, just tired. You disappeared, Grant. I kept a copy of every email I sent, every voicemail. After a while, I stopped trying. I had to focus on them. I looked back at the girls. They weren't crying. They weren't afraid. But there was distance, understandable, considering I was just a strange man in a suit, a ghost from a story they'd never been told. Clara, Rachel said gently, this is Grant. He's your daddy. The word hit me like a freight train. Clara tilted her head. He's my daddy? She asked. Half whisper, half curiosity. Rachel nodded. Yes, sweetie. Clara looked at me, long and hard. Then slowly she slid off the couch and walked over, one small hand reaching up to touch my knee. I froze. My heart climbed into my throat. She looked up at me. Do you like dinosaurs? The question came out of nowhere. I blinked, caught between laughter and tears. Yeah, I do. She smiled, showing 2 crooked baby teeth. Me too. I laughed, genuinely, for the first time in what felt like years. Something inside me cracked wide open. This wasn't theoretical anymore. This was real. She was real, and she had my eyes. I reached down, carefully, and touched her hand. Her skin was soft, warm, trusting. It was the most terrifying thing I'd ever felt. June remained where she was, leaning against Rachel, more reserved, watching, processing. I glanced at Rachel. What happens now? She looked exhausted, hopeful, guarded. I don't know. I didn't come here with a plan. I just needed you to know. I nodded slowly. I need time to understand this, but I want to know them. I want to try. Rachel searched my face for something. Fear, sincerity, regret. Whatever she found seemed to soften her features. Trying is a good start, she said. Just don't disappear this time. I reached across the table, not to touch her, just to close the distance. I won't. I meant it. I didn't know what this was going to look like. I didn't have a playbook or a polished response. But I knew one thing as clearly as I had ever known anything. Those girls were mine, and I wasn't going to miss another minute. I didn't sleep that night. After Rachel left with the girls, I returned to my penthouse overlooking the bay, but it felt colder than usual, like someone had drained the warmth from the walls. I loosened my tie, sat in the dark with a glass of scotch, and stared out the window. San Francisco blinked beneath me like a restless beast. Cars crawling down Market Street, the fog rolling in like a curtain, the lights on the Bay Bridge flickering like nervous thoughts. Clara, June, my daughters. I said the words out loud to the empty room, and they sounded foreign. Heavy, almost unreal. For so long I'd lived in a kind of suspended belief that children, a family, were simply not part of my story. That door had been closed with such finality that I never dared peek behind it again. And now here I was, standing in front of it again, not just peeking, but being pulled through it by 2 little girls in pink jackets with my eyes. My mind kept circling back to the DNA test. I'd read it 3 times since Rachel handed it to me. There was no room for doubt, no loopholes or questions. I was their biological father. So what now? A million questions buzzed in my head, each one louder than the last. How had this happened? Could the original diagnosis have been wrong? Was it a fluke? A 1 in a billion anomaly? Or had the doctor simply misread the results, ruined 3 years of my life with one sterile sentence? But the louder voice, the one I couldn't silence, wasn't asking how. It was asking why. Why had I run? Why had I left Rachel without even giving her a chance to understand? Because I was ashamed. That was the truth. The raw, bleeding core of it. I didn't just grieve the idea of fatherhood. I grieved what it said about me as a man. I had built my entire identity around success, around capability, around control. The moment a doctor told me I couldn't father children, I felt defective. Like all the power I had accumulated meant nothing. And Rachel, she was everything good, everything soft. She wanted a life, a family. I had convinced myself that by leaving, I was sparing her the slow heartbreak of settling for someone who couldn't give her what she truly wanted. I thought I was protecting her. But now, staring into my reflection in the glass, I saw it for what it was. Cowardice, neatly disguised as nobility. And Rachel had paid the price. She had carried those children without me, raised them, protected them, taught them to laugh, to trust, to smile. And I missed it all. I thought about the way Clara looked at me when she asked about dinosaurs. So casual. So disarming. She had no idea what she had done to me in that moment. How she'd cracked the dam of years I spent pretending not to care. I ran a hand through my hair and tried to breathe through the tightness in my chest. There was no roadmap for this, no 5-year plan. I couldn't spreadsheet my way into fatherhood, couldn't schedule a relationship with 2 toddlers, but I could start. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in years. Rachel answered on the second ring. "You okay?" she asked. Her voice was cautious but not cold. "I think so," I said. "I haven't slept." "Me neither." A silence stretched between us, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was loaded, shared. "I want to meet them again," I said finally. "Soon." There was a pause. I could hear her exhale slowly, like she'd been waiting for me to say that. "Okay, tomorrow, we'll be at the park near my place, around 10. I'll be there." We didn't say goodbye. The line just ended, like we were afraid if we lingered too long, something would break. The next morning, I showed up early. The park was small, nothing like the manicured corporate green spaces I was used to. There were swings with peeling paint, a sandbox full of forgotten toys, and a group of parents chatting near a jungle gym. The air smelled like damp bark and fresh-cut grass. It was real, unfiltered. Rachel arrived 10 minutes later, holding both girls by the hand. My heart slammed against my ribs. Clara spotted me first. Her face lit up, and she tugged at Rachel's arm. "Look, it's the dinosaur guy." Rachel laughed, and so did I. They approached slowly. Clara let go of Rachel's hand and ran ahead. June stayed close, still wary. "Hi again," Clara said, eyes wide. "You came. I told you I liked dinosaurs, didn't I?" I said, kneeling to her level. She nodded solemnly. "Do you want to see my T-Rex? He roars." "I'd love that." Rachel handed her a small backpack. Clara dug into it like a little archaeologist and pulled out a battered green T-Rex toy with a chunk missing from its tail. She handed it to me like it was sacred. I named him Benny. I smiled and gently made the toy growl, and she squealed with laughter. It was the most beautiful sound I'd heard in years. June still hadn't moved. She watched me like a hawk, thumb in her mouth, eyes unreadable. Rachel crouched beside her and whispered something. June hesitated, then nodded. "She wants you to push her on the swing," Rachel translated. My throat tightened. I stood, walked over, and gently lifted her into the seat. She didn't look at me, but she didn't pull away either. I started pushing slowly, letting her set the rhythm. With every swing, her ponytail bounced a little higher. Eventually, she let out a quiet giggle. It was the tiniest crack in the wall she'd built, and I clung to it like a lifeline. Rachel watched us from a nearby bench. I could feel her eyes on me, but I didn't look. I didn't want to ruin the moment. When the girls got tired, we sat on a picnic blanket Rachel had brought. Clara snuggled beside me, holding Benny. June curled into Rachel's lap. We ate crackers and apple slices and talked about absolutely nothing. Shapes, clouds, a duck that waddled by with no sense of urgency. And in that space of simple things, something massive shifted inside me. I wasn't just visiting their world. I wanted to be part of it. Afterward, as Rachel packed up the bag, I stayed kneeling beside Clara. "I'm glad you came today," she said with the seriousness of a tiny philosopher. "Me too," I replied. Then she leaned in, kissed my cheek, and whispered, "You can come next time too." My hands trembled as I helped Rachel with the stroller. She looked at me, something unreadable in her gaze. "You really meant it, didn't you?" she asked. "That you want to try?" I met her eyes. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." She nodded. "Just once. But it was enough." That night, I stood in my living room, holding Benny the T-Rex in one hand. Clara had forgotten him, and Rachel had texted that we could bring it next time. There would be a next time. For the first time in years, the silence in my apartment didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like a pause before something new began. The third time I visited Rachel and the girls, something shifted. I could feel it in the way Clara ran to me, arms open, no hesitation this time. I could see it in the way June no longer clung to Rachel's leg but stood on her own, waiting for me to acknowledge her. And I could sense it in Rachel herself, her posture a little looser, her smile no longer strained with caution. It was subtle, but it was there, a fragile thread beginning to form between us all. Rachel had invited me over to their apartment that Saturday, a small place on the second floor of a weathered building in the inner Sunset District. It smelled like lavender, cinnamon, and something sweet baking in the kitchen. The walls were cluttered with life. Photos, children's drawings, a height chart scribbled in crayon next to the fridge. It felt lived in, chaotic, real. And I loved it instantly. "You don't have to take your shoes off." Rachel called from the kitchen as I stepped inside, holding a stuffed Benny the T-Rex that Clara had forgotten again during our last visit. Clara came barreling around the corner before I could even respond, crashing into my legs with a delighted, "You brought him back." I crouched, handing over the dinosaur. "He missed you." June peeked around the hallway, her eyes cautious but curious. She still hadn't spoken a full sentence to me yet. But that morning she surprised me by offering a silent wave. It was a small victory, but I held on to it like a man starving for hope. Rachel appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She wore a faded sweatshirt and leggings, her hair up in a loose bun. She looked tired, like always, but beneath that, she glowed. I don't know if it was the light streaming through the kitchen window or something internal, but she radiated something I hadn't seen since before we broke up. It wasn't happiness exactly, more like presence, like she had finally exhaled after holding her breath for 3 years. "Can you stay for lunch?" she asked, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "If I say no, will Clara cry?" Clara, now busy having a full conversation with Benny in the corner, lifted her head and shouted, "Yes." Rachel laughed. "There's your answer." We ate grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup at a table too small for 4 people. The girls sat in booster seats, flinging crumbs and telling stories that made no sense but demanded full attention. I listened like I was at a shareholders meeting, nodding, asking questions, pretending to understand the intricacies of unicorn drama and sandbox politics. Rachel watched me, quiet amusement in her eyes. I caught her looking once or twice, but she didn't say anything. Just smiled, as if seeing me in this context was some strange twist of fate she still didn't trust to be real. After lunch, Clara insisted I help her build a pillow fort in the living room. I was halfway through stacking couch cushions when June came over with a blanket and handed it to me without a word. I took it gently, nodding my thanks. She blinked, then turned back to her toys. "She's warming up," Rachel whispered beside me. "She's just slow to trust." "So am I," I said, realizing it only as the words left my mouth. By the time the fort was finished, all 4 of us were inside. Clara insisted on assigning roles. She was the queen, June the baby dragon, I was the knight, and Rachel, much to her chagrin, was the cook. I had never seen Rachel laugh the way she did inside that fortress of blankets, her head thrown back, her hand clutching her side. And I realized something else. I hadn't laughed like that in years either. When the girls finally tired out, Rachel led them into their shared bedroom for naps. I offered to help, and to my surprise, she let me. I watched as she tucked them in, gently brushing hair from their foreheads, whispering songs that probably hadn't changed since they were newborns. She kissed Clara's forehead, then June's, then turned to leave. Halfway to the door, Clara's voice stopped her. "Will he kiss us too?" Rachel froze. She turned slowly to me, and something unreadable passed between us. It was a moment suspended in uncertainty, a test neither of us had prepared for. I stepped forward, kneeling by the bed. "Only if that's okay," I said gently. Clara nodded eagerly. I leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, then turned to June, who looked up at me with wide eyes. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. I kissed her gently too. Rachel's hand gripped the doorframe. Her knuckles were white. We walked out in silence. Back in the kitchen, she poured us both coffee, her hands trembling slightly. "I didn't expect that," she admitted. "Neither did I." We stood there for a long time, sipping our coffees, not looking at each other. The silence between us was thicker now, no longer uncomfortable, but heavy with emotion neither of us knew how to voice. Finally, she broke it. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if you hadn't walked away?" "All the time," I said. "More than I want to admit." She looked at me then, really looked. "Why did you disappear, Grant? I know you told me it was the infertility diagnosis, but why didn't you trust me with that?" I closed my eyes. "Because I thought it made me less of a man. Because I didn't want to see pity in your eyes. Because I didn't know how to be vulnerable without falling apart." Rachel nodded slowly, absorbing every word. "I would have stayed, even if that test had been right. Even if we couldn't have children, I didn't love you for your genetics." "I know that now," I whispered. Another long silence. Then she sighed. "This is hard. I don't expect it to be easy," I said. "But I want to be here, Rachel, however long it takes, whatever it takes." She nodded slowly, as if each movement of her head cost her something. "Okay." I helped her clean the kitchen. I folded the blanket from the fort. I kissed the girls' foreheads again before I left, even though they were asleep and wouldn't remember. On my way out, she walked me to the door. "I'll text you tomorrow," she said, her voice quieter now. "I'll be waiting." She opened the door, and I stepped into the hallway, pausing for just a second before turning back. Rachel? Yeah? I missed everything. Their first words, their first steps, their birthdays. I can't get that time back, but I don't want to miss anything else. Her eyes softened, and for the first time since the day she walked back into my life, she smiled without sadness. Then don't. It happened on a Thursday night in the middle of an unexpected downpour. I had just wrapped up a late meeting, the kind filled with jargon and tension, and was riding the elevator down from my office when my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, expecting a calendar alert or another email from legal. But it wasn't. It was Rachel. The text was short, hurried. June has a high fever. She's not herself. I don't know what to do. I didn't stop to think. I didn't reply. I didn't even tell my assistant I was leaving. I grabbed my coat, ducked into the rain, and ran to my car like a man chasing something he wasn't willing to lose this time. By the time I reached her apartment, I was soaked through. My hair clung to my forehead. My shoes squished with every step. I knocked hard, 3 times before the door cracked open and Rachel appeared. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed with worry. Her voice shook as she whispered, "She's in the nursery. She won't stop crying." I stepped in without asking, pulling off my coat, water dripping onto the hardwood. The apartment, usually so warm and buzzing with soft laughter and chaos, was hushed. The living room lights were dimmed. Toys were untouched. Clara was asleep on the couch, curled into a ball with her thumb tucked in her mouth, clutching Benny the T-Rex like a lifeline. Rachel led me through the narrow hallway to the nursery. June was lying on her side, whimpering. Her cheeks were flushed a deep, unnatural pink. Sweat beaded on her forehead. She tossed and turned in restless discomfort, and the moment she saw Rachel, she reached out with trembling arms, a tiny sound escaping her lips. It was the sound of helplessness, of a child who couldn't understand why her body was betraying her. Without thinking, I stepped forward and scooped her into my arms. Her skin was hot. Too hot. She curled against my chest, feverish and trembling. "She wouldn't let me hold her like that," Rachel whispered. "She's been crying for hours." I tightened my grip gently, supporting June's head, swaying back and forth as instinct kicked in where experience hadn't yet reached. "She's okay," I murmured, not sure if I was saying it for Rachel, for June, or for myself. "We're okay." Rachel was already on the phone with the pediatrician. Her voice trembled as she answered questions. Yes, the fever was over 102. No, she hadn't thrown up. Yes, she was drinking fluids earlier, but less now. I caught fragments as I continued rocking June in the half-dark room, her sobs growing quieter, her breathing slowing. When Rachel hung up, she turned to me. "They think it's viral. We just have to keep her cool, hydrated, monitor through the night." "I'll stay," I said instantly. Her mouth parted as if to protest, but nothing came out. She just nodded. We moved to the living room and made a nest on the couch. I sat upright with June against my chest, Rachel beside me, a wet washcloth in her hand. We passed it back and forth, pressing it gently to June's forehead. Time became a blur. The storm outside pounded against the windows, thunder rolling like distant drums. Inside it was just the 3 of us, sleepless, worried, tangled in exhaustion and something else, something deeper. At some point, Rachel leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. It wasn't necessary. Our hearts were already speaking in a language we hadn't used in years. "I'm glad you're here," she whispered hours later, her voice barely audible over the hum of the rain. I didn't realize how much I needed someone to lean on until right now. I shifted slightly, brushing my cheek against her hair. "You don't have to do this alone anymore, Rachel." She didn't reply, but she didn't move away either. Around dawn, June finally fell into a deep, steady sleep. Her fever had broken. Her breathing was soft and even, her little hands curled into fists beneath her chin. Rachel rose to carry her back to her crib, but I stopped her. "I've got her," I said quietly, and walked slowly to the nursery. I laid her down, careful not to wake her, tucking the blanket around her tiny body like she was made of glass. When I returned, Rachel was still sitting on the couch, staring at nothing. Her eyes were glazed with exhaustion. "Go rest," I said. "I'll stay a little longer." She nodded and moved aside so I could sit beside her again. But instead of pulling away, she leaned into me, her head back on my shoulder. This time she closed her eyes. We stayed like that for what felt like hours. The sun rose behind the curtains, streaking the room with soft, golden light. Outside, the rain had stopped. Inside, the world felt changed. Not with words or promises, but with presence. When Rachel stirred again, it was well past morning. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, glancing toward the hallway. "She's still sleeping," I said. She exhaled in relief and turned to look at me. And for a moment, we just sat there, watching each other. "I meant what I said," I told her, voice rough with emotion, "about being here. You don't have to carry it all anymore. I want to be part of this. Every hard night, every messy day." Her eyes searched mine. She didn't rush to speak. She didn't give me some romantic line or dramatic affirmation. Instead, she reached out and took my hand, gently, hesitantly, threading her fingers through mine like she wasn't sure it was allowed. "Okay," she said softly, "then stay." And I did. Not just that morning, but in every way that mattered. I stayed through breakfast with sleepy Clara and a still tired June who wanted only to be held. I stayed through folding laundry and wiping counters and washing tiny pink cups. I stayed because I had finally learned something the hard way. Being present was not just about showing up. It was about staying through the uncomfortable, the messy, the real. That night, I returned home to my penthouse, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a space I used to live in, a chapter I had already outgrown. I didn't sleep on silk sheets that night. I didn't look out over a glowing skyline and think about market shares or IPOs. Instead, I lay awake thinking about the way Rachel's hand felt in mine, about the soft weight of June against my chest, about the tiny voice that had whispered "Daddy" in a half-dream state before falling back asleep. For the first time in years, I wasn't restless. I was rooted, and somewhere deep inside me, something whispered that I wasn't just visiting their lives anymore. I was finally home. Over the next several weeks, something in me began to shift. Slowly at first, like thawing ground after a long winter. I started showing up more and staying longer. What began as brief visits turned into full afternoons, and eventually entire weekends spent at Rachel's apartment, learning the rhythms of her life and the strange, wonderful chaos that came with Clara and June. I was clumsy at first, comically so. I couldn't figure out the latches on their car seats. I once put June's diaper on backward. I burned pancakes, mistook a sippy cup of milk for my coffee, and accidentally sat on a talking unicorn toy that screamed "magic" in front of Rachel's visiting neighbor. But Rachel never laughed at me cruelly. She'd smirk, amused but forgiving, and gently show me how it was done. The girls, on the other hand, found my errors endlessly hilarious. Clara had begun calling me rookie. Still, I kept coming back. Not just because I wanted to, because I needed to. There was something about their world, messy, loud, unpredictable, that made my pristine, solitary life feel sterile by comparison. I had spent years in control. Now I was surrounded by cereal spills, impromptu sing-alongs, sticky fingers, and bedtime stories that always demanded just one more. It was exhausting, and it was beautiful. Rachel was cautious with me, understandably so. Though our interactions had grown warmer, even comfortable, there was always a quiet boundary she didn't let me cross. We talked, we co-parented, we shared dinners and dishes, but she never leaned too far. She was kind, but guarded. Receptive, but restrained. One evening, after the girls had fallen asleep, Clara in her dinosaur pajamas, June curled up with her bunny, I lingered in the kitchen, drying dishes as Rachel loaded the dishwasher. The air was filled with the scent of lavender and soap. We moved around each other in easy silence. I handed her a clean mug. She took it, their fingers brushing lightly. "You've gotten better at this," she said, nodding toward the drying rack. "I remember the first time you tried to wash a bottle. You looked like you were disarming a bomb." "I've been training," I said. "There's a whole YouTube black hole on the subject." She laughed, that quiet, breathy sound I hadn't heard in years. It stirred something in me. Something old, something dangerous. I leaned against the counter, studying her face, the soft curve of her cheek, the faint lines at the corner of her eyes from too many sleepless nights. She was more beautiful now than I remembered, because this time I saw all of her. Not just the woman I loved, but the mother, the survivor, the fire that kept everything burning even when I had vanished. "I've been thinking about the past," I said, voice low. "How I handled everything, what I walked away from." Rachel didn't look at me. She kept her eyes on the sponge in her hand, rinsing a plate slowly, methodically. We both made mistakes, Grant. I stepped closer. But mine came with a cost. You shouldn't have had to do this alone. She put the plate down, wiped her hands, and finally met my eyes. You're here now. That doesn't undo the hurt. No, it doesn't, she said gently, but showing up matters. We stood in silence. Not awkward silence, but heavy, charged. I miss you. I said before I could stop myself. Not just the girls, you. Her eyes softened, but there was pain behind them too. This isn't simple, I know. You left once, she whispered. And you didn't just leave me, you left the version of yourself who could have been part of all this. I had to rebuild everything from scratch. I hate that, I said. I hate what I did, and I can't promise I'll always get it right now, but I can promise I won't disappear again. I want this. All of it. The girls, the dishes, the tantrums, the late nights. You. Rachel exhaled, and it sounded like the release of a weight too long carried. I see the way you look at them, she said. The way they look at you. They trust you. They love you. And I believe you mean this. I do. But you'll have to keep showing it. I will, I said. Every day. She nodded once. Then, with a gentleness that nearly undid me, she stepped forward and rested her forehead against my chest. I wrapped my arms around her, not tightly, just enough to say, I'm here. We stayed like that for a long time, the kitchen quiet around us, the house finally still. No dramatic declarations, no rushed promises, just breath and presence and the slow, cautious stitching of something that had once been torn. After that night, things didn't change overnight, but they began to bend. Rachel didn't pull away when I touched her hand. I started staying later, helping with bath time, brushing tangled hair, reading books about magical hamsters, and singing vegetables. Clara began drawing pictures of our family with me in them. June called me Da when she was sleepy and forgot to be shy. It wasn't perfect. There were moments of tension, days when I felt unsure of my place, but we were finding our rhythm. Not just as co-parents, as something more. One afternoon, we took the girls to the botanical gardens. The sky was clear, the sun soft, the paths lined with blooming camellias. Clara ran ahead, pretending to be a jungle explorer. June clung to Rachel's hand, her face squinting into the light. We stopped near a small pond. The girls sat on a bench eating fruit snacks, their feet swinging. Rachel and I stood a few feet away, watching them. They look happy, I said. They are, she replied. They've always had love. Now they just have more of it. I glanced at her. And what about you? She looked at me, then smiled, not with caution, but with hope. I'm getting there. In that moment, I realized something that hadn't fully crystallized until then. Rachel wasn't just someone I loved. She was someone I admired, not for surviving, though she had, but for choosing to keep her heart open after everything, for letting me try again, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a man chasing redemption. I felt like a man building a life, slowly, honestly, together. On a brisk Sunday morning in early spring, I found myself pacing a quiet stretch of orchard just outside the city. Rows of apple trees were beginning to bud, soft green tips pushing through bare branches. The air smelled like promise, like new beginnings. Clara and June were somewhere behind me, giggling as they chased butterflies through the grass. Rachel was helping set up a picnic blanket near a little hill that overlooked the valley. In my hand, I held a small velvet box. I'd spent weeks debating whether to bring it. Not because I had doubts, those had long since faded, but because I didn't want this moment to feel like pressure. I didn't want to propose just because it made sense, or because we had children, or because we were halfway to playing house already. I wanted to propose because I knew, without hesitation, that I wanted to build the rest of my life with this woman. It had taken time, months of rebuilding trust, of showing up day after day, of learning how to exist together without the old walls between us. But we were there now. She trusted me with the girls. She trusted me with her home, her routines, her fears, and slowly she was starting to trust me with her heart again. I hadn't planned a grand gesture. No string quartet, no skywriting, no orchestrated speeches, just this orchard, this picnic, and our 2 daughters, who thought the day was all about juice boxes and tiny cupcakes. When everyone had settled and the girls were busy stacking leaves into fairy houses, I walked over to Rachel. She was sitting on the blanket, wearing a light sweater and jeans, her hair pulled into a messy braid, her smile soft as she watched the girls. The sunlight caught the edges of her face, making her glow in a way that made my chest ache. "Got a minute?" I asked, my voice quieter than usual. She looked up, eyebrows raised. "Of course." I reached out my hand. "Come walk with me?" She took it without question, rising to her feet as we strolled toward a quieter corner of the orchard. The grass was damp but not muddy, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. I could hear the girls' laughter behind us, fading slightly as we walked farther. Rachel was quiet for a few moments, glancing at me sidelong. "You're nervous," she said. I laughed under my breath. "Terrified, actually." She stopped walking, turning to face me. "Grant, what's going on?" I took a breath and pulled the box from my pocket, not dropping to one knee, just opening it slowly, honestly, like I was offering a piece of my soul. "I used to think I wasn't meant for this," I began. "Not for love, not for family, definitely not for you. When I left, it wasn't because I stopped loving you. It was because I didn't believe I was enough for the life you wanted. I let fear make decisions I'll always regret." Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't interrupt. "I came back because of the girls, yes, but I stayed because of you, because of the way you opened your door to me when you didn't have to, because you didn't just survive without me, you created something beautiful. And somehow, you let me back into that. You let me love them. You let me love you again." Her hands trembled slightly as I pressed the box into her palm. Inside was a simple ring. No ostentation, no diamonds as big as their story. Just an elegant band with a small sapphire in the center, the color of June's eyes. "Rachel Moore," I said, voice thick. "Will you marry me? Not because we're supposed to, but because I want to wake up next to you for the rest of my life. Because I want to raise Clara and June together. Because I want to build something with you, not perfect, but honest, real." She didn't say anything at first. She just stared at the ring, then up at me, then back again. Her lips parted, but no words came. Then, finally, she nodded, a tear rolling down her cheek. "Yes," she whispered. "God, yes." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding and pulled her into my arms. Her body melted into mine like she belonged there, which of course she did. From the distance, Clara's voice shouted, "Are you hugging again?" We both laughed, breaking apart just in time to see the girls running toward us, leaves tangled in their hair and cheeks flushed with joy. Rachel crouched and pulled them close, showing them the ring. Clara gasped, "Is that a princess ring?" "Kind of," Rachel said, smiling. "Grant gave it to me." June blinked. "Why?" Rachel met my eyes, and her voice was steady. "Because he's going to marry me." Clara shrieked in delight. "Do we get to wear dresses?" I knelt down beside them. "Yes, and eat cake." They both squealed, and suddenly we were wrapped in a tangle of arms, laughter, and sticky fingers. The four of us collapsed on the picnic blanket, the ring glinting in the sunlight, and for the first time I felt the full weight of what we had become. Not a man and a woman trying to piece together a broken past, not even a family defined by paperwork or tradition. But something deeper. We were a choice. A series of brave, beautiful choices that led us back to one another, even when it would have been easier to stay apart. Later that night, after the girls were asleep and we were back at Rachel's apartment, she handed me a glass of wine and curled beside me on the couch. "Did you always plan to propose today?" she asked. "No," I said honestly. "I brought the ring with me for the past few weeks, just in case." She smiled, her fingers brushing the band on her hand. "I'm glad it was today." "Me too." We sat in silence, letting the moment settle. Outside, the wind rustled the branches of the tree near her balcony. Inside, everything was still, peaceful, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't bracing for disaster or doubting what came next. I knew who I was now, not because of what I had achieved, but because of who I had chosen, and who had chosen me in return. Rachel leaned her head on my shoulder, her voice a soft hum. "I never thought we'd find our way back." I kissed the top of her head. "I think we had to fall apart to build it right. And maybe that's what love really was. Not perfection, but the decision to stay, to rebuild, to try again, and to never let go." The months after Rachel said yes didn't unfold like some whirlwind fairy tale. There were no magazine-worthy engagement shoots, no champagne-popping parties, no endless discussions about color palettes or seating charts. What there was, what we chose, was quieter, deeper. Something that grew slowly, not because we were hesitating, but because we knew this time we wanted to get it right. We settled into a rhythm that felt more like life than anything I had ever known. I still ran my company, still sat in boardrooms and negotiated multi-million-dollar contracts. But now I left early when I could. I ignored emails after 6 p.m. I took calls on mute while helping Clara pour cereal or while coloring at the kitchen table with June, who had recently discovered a passion for drawing scary princesses with fire powers. Rachel and I learned how to exist as a team. We navigated temper tantrums, spilled smoothies, late-night fevers, and the logistical chaos of preschool enrollment. Some mornings were a blur of mismatched socks and forgotten backpacks. Some evenings ended with us falling asleep in the girls' room mid-bedtime story, curled up on the floor like exhausted crash survivors. And in all that messy beauty, we found each other again. The girls adjusted quickly. Clara began introducing me as my dad, who used to live in a tower but now lives with us. June warmed even faster than I expected. One evening, after she woke up from a nightmare, she crawled into bed between Rachel and me, curled against my chest, and fell back asleep without a word. I didn't sleep much that night, not because she kicked me in her sleep, which she did, but because I couldn't stop staring at her, feeling her heartbeat against mine and thinking, this is what I almost missed. We chose to hold the wedding in Rachel's sister's backyard, a modest patch of grass shaded by old oak trees with twinkling lights strung between the branches. We didn't send out hundreds of invitations, just close family, a few friends, and 2 flower girls who took their duties very seriously. Clara practiced scattering petals for weeks. June insisted on wearing a tiara that lit up every time she moved. Rachel wore a simple ivory dress with lace at the sleeves. Her hair was pinned up, soft curls escaping to frame her face. I wore a navy suit, no tie, no fanfare. I didn't need anything more. The moment I saw her walking down that makeshift aisle, hand in hand with our daughters, everything else disappeared. My breath caught. My knees almost gave out. Not because I was nervous, but because I had never known a person could feel so full and still have room for more. Our vows weren't rehearsed. We spoke from the quiet places inside us, the ones that had been bruised, broken, and healed through time and truth. I never expected to love you again like this, Rachel said softly. But you showed me that love the second time around doesn't mean it's less. It means it's stronger, braver. I took her hands and replied, I used to think I had everything, then I lost you, and I realized I had nothing. Today, I'm standing here because you gave me another chance. Not just to love you, but to become the man I should have been all along. The girls clapped before the officiant could even say, you may kiss the bride. And when we did, it wasn't dramatic or dipped in applause. It was simple. Sure, like something we'd been doing for years. Afterward, we ate cupcakes, drank champagne from mismatched glasses, and watched the girls chase each other through the grass with ribbons tied to sticks. I remember looking around at that little gathering and thinking, this is everything I never knew I needed. It wasn't about grandeur. It was about grace. We moved into a house not far from Rachel's old apartment. It wasn't flashy. 3 bedrooms, a sunroom, and a backyard just big enough for a swing set and a tiny garden Rachel insisted the girls would take care of. They didn't, of course. I ended up watering the tomatoes most evenings, but I didn't mind. The sound of Clara's laughter through the open window while I hosed the garden felt better than any skyline view I'd ever known. At night, after the girls were asleep and the house settled into quiet, Rachel and I would sit on the porch with mugs of tea or the occasional glass of wine. We talked about everything, school options, future vacations, maybe even another baby someday. But those talks were never rushed. We had learned not to race forward. We had learned how to stay. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. We just sat there, her head on my shoulder, the stars overhead, the hum of distant crickets in the background, and the knowledge between us that we had built something rare. Not perfection, but permanence. I kept working, of course, but my ambition had changed. I was still the CEO, still respected in my field. But my goals were no longer about how many zeros followed a deal. They were about leaving work in time to pick up Clara from art club. About not missing June's recital, even if she only stood on stage and waved. My colleagues noticed the shift. I didn't bark orders the way I used to. I asked more questions. I listened more. I smiled more. One evening, Rachel caught me dancing in the living room with both girls to an old Motown song. June on my feet, Clara on my hip. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, pretending not to cry. "You're ridiculous," she whispered. "You married ridiculous," I said. She laughed and joined us, and for a few minutes we danced like no one was watching, like life had always been this way, and maybe in some strange way, it always had been leading to this. I used to define my worth by what I owned, what I achieved, what I controlled. Now, I measured my days in different currency. Bedtime kisses, finger paint masterpieces taped to the fridge, Rachel's soft smile as she pulled her hair into a ponytail while making pancakes in the morning. I wasn't a perfect father. I still messed up. I forgot to sign field trip forms. I burned toast. I once bought June a toothbrush that played heavy metal instead of lullabies. But I showed up. I stayed. I kept learning. And in doing so, I became someone I actually liked. Not just successful, but whole. As the first anniversary of our wedding approached, Clara handed me a drawing. It was a messy, colorful masterpiece of stick figures. 4 of us holding hands. Underneath in bright pink crayon, she had written, "Our family, the real kind." I asked her what she meant, and she shrugged in that knowing way kids do. "You know," she said, "the kind that stays." I blinked back tears, pulled her close, and whispered into her hair, "Yes, sweetheart, I do now." And I did. Because in the end, the miracle wasn't that I found my way back to Rachel. It was that she and our girls waited with open hearts long enough for me to realize that love, when it's real, doesn't leave. It just waits. And when you're finally ready, it walks you home. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this story. If you're still here, it means this journey touched something inside you, and I'm truly grateful for your time. This story reminds us that it's never too late to make things right, that love, real love, can survive distance, time, even mistakes, if we're willing to show up, take responsibility, and choose it every single day. Sometimes the most powerful redemption doesn't come in grand gestures, but in quiet consistency, in choosing to stay when it's easier to walk away. If there's anything we hope you take from this, it's that second chances aren't just possible. They're often where the most beautiful beginnings start. Now I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Are you someone who believes in second chances? In family built not just by blood, but by heart? Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you never miss the next emotional, life-changing story. We have more coming, stories that heal, inspire, and remind us of the power of love, even when it arrives the second time around. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.